All right. Good afternoon. Good to see everybody here. I have to write these things out or I'll get off track. But welcome to the continuation of our 21-22 lecture series presented by the College of Environment Design. I'm one of the faculty here, Brad Davis, and it is my pleasure and honor to introduce our lecturer this afternoon, our very own Professor Katherine Melcher. And I do mean it's an honor and a pleasure because it's not usual that one gets to say this, but the rumors are true. Katherine and I were members of the same cohort at LSU. So we were in the same class from 1998 to 2001. That dates us a little bit. There were 16 of us in that cohort, and 3 of us have turned out to be faculty. So that says something about us. I'm not sure what. But from my memory, and Katherine can confirm or deny these facts later, when we first met, she had recently returned to the U.S. after a couple of years working in the Peace Corps in Central West Africa. I can't remember the exact nation. And before that, she had done her BA in sociology from Vassar College. And it was immediately apparent in those first meetings and first classes that Katherine was a quiet, intellectual force to be reckoned with. When asked to give this introduction, honestly, the first words that came into my head are derived from an ancient proverb, and it goes something like, either still or quiet waters run deep. And Katherine is not the noisemaker in the room usually, except maybe tonight. But when she speaks or writes, the words are studied and measured, and people listen. This is especially refreshing in today's culture of increasing noise. A consistent theme runs through Katherine's teaching and research: community. Her work skillfully weaves together a deep care and concern for humanity with the tools and knowledge that we possess as landscape architects to make the quality of life better for others. Just listen to some of the titles of her articles and books. Community Built: Art, Construction, Preservation, and Place. Many Voices: One Project. Participation and Aesthetics in Community-Built Practices. And Equity, Empowerment, or Participation: Prioritizing Goals in Community Design. Katherine's engagement also plays out here in CED Life. Over the past few years, we have placed an increasing emphasis on the creation of outwardly facing courses that are helpful, hopefully, to students from any major across UGA. Katherine has provided inspiring solutions, it seems, at every request. And her new course offerings reflect the same care and concern for others. And just listen to these 4 courses that she regularly teaches: Place, Society, and Design, the Engagement Studio, Community and Place Studio, and this spring, Designing Healthy Places. Did you know about that one? I also thought the university's recent strategic plan puts out a renewed call to solve the grand challenges of our time. Strategic Goal 3.1 states, increase collaborative, community-focused research, scholarships, technical assistance, and training in Georgia across the nation and world. Well, Katherine Melcher has already shown us the way. Join me in welcoming to the lectern Katherine Melcher.
Thank you. Wow. Thank you, Brad, for that amazing introduction. I haven't had that many introductions, but that's by far the best.
It's heartfelt.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you, Brad, for the introduction. I'd also like to thank the College of Environment and Design for hosting this lecture and the Spotlight on the Arts as well. And thank you all for taking some time out of your day for being here to, think a little bit about aesthetics in landscape architecture. So, as my title suggests, I do have a confession to make. And now that I'm a tenured professor, I have some gray hairs, I am a licensed landscape architect. I think I can finally admit this. And my confession is that when it comes to landscape architecture, I have bad taste. And it feels good to get that off my chest. I've been in denial about it for a while, but and hopefully my students will respect me tomorrow in class, but that's the case here. But of course, it all depends on how you define good and bad taste. So, I guess when I'm talking about good taste for landscape architecture, I'm thinking about award-winning projects that end up in museum exhibits, internationally renowned museums, ones that get published in books and republished in books, and again, more award-winning projects. So that's what I think we're kind of taught, what is good taste in landscape architecture. But if we define aesthetics, and of course there's a lot of different ways to define aesthetics, and we'll get into some of those today. If we define it as just a simple, immediate experience of pleasure and delight, if I'm really honest with myself, the places that give me that pleasure and delight are places like this. And these. And I have several of these, so we'll just go through some of them. And I put this one in there because it is, in the landscape architecture history books, because I don't want you to think that, Professor Melcher just likes vernacular landscapes and she doesn't like design landscapes. I kind of want to overcome that dichotomy, because if that means that I only like vernacular landscapes, that means I can't ever design anything that I like. So that just doesn't make sense to me. Anyway, so those are the things that I find delightful. But where does that leave me in my bad taste? I could try to better myself, educate myself to have good taste, but after 20 years of studying and teaching design, and even pursuing a PhD in aesthetics, my taste still kind of remains the same. And some may claim that aesthetic taste is an innate sense. Either you have it or you don't, and therefore I'm forever doomed to bad taste. But I also refuse to accept that. Instead, I think we need to take a closer look at what we mean when we talk about aesthetics in landscape architecture. And in my opinion, aesthetic ideals in landscape architecture are ill-defined and somewhat arbitrary. And one could say that aesthetics in landscape architecture is kind of an emperor's new clothes. Aesthetic ideals are, to use Katherine Moore's words, the sort of thing we might think is important to know about, for us to know about, but without being entirely sure why. And because we, and when I say we right now, I'm talking about landscape architects, are not quite sure how to define, describe, or evaluate aesthetics, we avoid talking about it. Because we do not talk about aesthetics, they remain difficult to challenge or question. Although some of us, like myself, suspect there's little going on underneath. And so there is, on a broader level, there's a general concern within landscape architecture theory, as these two quotes suggest, that the lack of aesthetic debate within the discourse is weakening the profession. If we do not have the words to describe what we do and why we do it, we cannot teach it, we cannot evaluate it, and therefore we cannot improve it. So I have two objectives with this presentation. The first is to provide some clarity around how the concept of aesthetics has been understood and used within landscape architecture. And my goal here is not to present one true definition of aesthetics, but more to clarify the different ways it has been used and can be used to explain places and design. And with a clear understanding of these meanings and uses, maybe we can have a more vigorous debate about the aesthetic value of our landscapes. And my ulterior motive, my second objective, is that with this philosophical exploration, I hope to create space within landscape aesthetics for my own taste. I hope I can better explain why I like the places that I like, and also why that taste might be valuable to how I approach design. So again, my goal today is not for you all to march out here in unison and say, yes, Professor Melcher is right, she has the best taste. It's more that I hope you leave here today with some tools and thoughts that help you explain why you find some places delightful and pleasurable. All right. So to answer this question, of course, I reviewed texts in landscape architecture theory, especially those about aesthetics. I also looked at key themes and texts from the philosophy of aesthetics to see what the similarities are. And during this review, I came up with the theory that aesthetics in landscape architecture can be roughly categorized into three perspectives. And I call those aesthetics as the beautiful, aesthetics as the meaningful, and aesthetics as experience. And these three uses developed somewhat chronologically within landscape architecture, with aesthetics as the beautiful as being at the beginning of the profession, and interest in meaning kind of blossomed and expanded in about the 1980s and 1990s. And the past couple of decades, there's been more discussion about aesthetics as the experience. But all three of them are still used in the discourse today, and sometimes they're pitted against each other, while other times they're used in combination. And so I'm going to explain each of these in more detail. I'll go through their primary principles, how I see them reflected in landscape architecture, and then some of their criticisms. All right, so aesthetics as the beautiful kind of emerges with the birth of aesthetic theory, which was during the Enlightenment. And it was also the time when landscape garden design started becoming a profession. And some of the key philosophers are Immanuel Kant and Edmund Burke. This approach claims that aesthetic experience is an experience of pleasure that occurs when one perceives an object, such as a landscape, as being beautiful. In addition to beauty, other experiences such as the sublime and the picturesque were included in aesthetics because they evoke a similar feeling of pleasure. So according to Kant's definition of the beautiful, aesthetic pleasure is simply an immediate sensation. You look at something and you just claim, how beautiful. It does not come from an interest in what is useful or in what is morally good. So for example, in this image, Kant would say you just can look at it and feel that it's beautiful. It doesn't matter what environmental conditions actually produced this picture. And so within landscape architecture, theorists of the beautiful focus on the arrangement of elements in a landscape and how those can create beautiful scenes. And many of you if you took landscape architecture history, you're probably familiar with the red books from Humphrey Repton, which illustrates how we looked at landscapes as scenes, with before and after pictures for the clients of how they would improve the views of the landscape. And although Kant argued that beauty cannot be created by following a set of rules, the generalized idea in landscape architecture is that the ideal composition is one that creates a sense of unity, yet still creates variety, enough variety to keep one's interest. So, the early landscape garden design was, largely influenced by the aesthetic philosophy of Edmund Burke. But Kant's theories were rediscovered and embraced in the 20th century by the formalist movement in art. And modern landscape architecture, to a certain degree, followed the precedents set by art and then also the modernist movement in architecture. And so by the mid-20th century in landscape architecture, the aim of creating pleasing compositions was applied not only to the perspective scenes, but also to the plan view arrangements. And we can see this approach in Norman Booth's introductory text, Foundations of Landscape Architecture, where you're looking at landscape plans that are designed as compositions of basic form, and it's regardless of context, but you're trying to create a sense of unity in the plan, but also a sense of variety to keep it interesting. And so we see this focus on formal composition reflected in many parks and plaza designs, especially those in the last half of the 20th century. And although forms may respond to site and function in general, the driving aesthetic vision is one to create a coherent yet dynamic composition. So the irony is that although Kant was an inspiration for the formalist movement in art, when it comes to landscapes, Kant was actually against the use of these simple geometric shapes. To him, simple geometries, such as those that form property lines or crop rows, are utilitarian and therefore not beautiful. He says, and I quote, "Where some purpose is perceived, for instance, that of judging the area of a plot of land, the delight does not rest immediately upon the way the figure strikes the eye, but upon its serviceability for all manner of possible purposes. And he concludes, as the quote says here, all stiff regularity is inherently repugnant to taste, and that the contemplation of it affords us no lasting entertainment. And whereas nature, subject to no constraint of artificial rules, as lavish as there is, in the luxuriant variety can supply constant nourishment for our taste. All right. So, some criticisms of the beautiful approach. So critics point out that its emphasis on a visual scene tends to flatten landscapes into static, two-dimensional pictures. So it ignores that we do not only view landscapes from a distance, we also move through them and experience them with our senses. It ignores that landscapes are more than compositions, they are places for living. You know, the nice order of a coherent composition, like the image in the upper right, inevitably gets messed up by people parking cars, going to the beach, and otherwise using and enjoying the site. And this approach also neglects that landscapes themselves are dynamic, growing and changing over time. Trees die, they don't naturally grow in grid formations. Dunes will shift their shapes over time. And finally, discussions of compositional form imply that there's a universal ideal aesthetic. Kant believed it was what he called a subjective universal, which is kind of a tricky idea, but he meant that when you experience something beautiful, you experience it subjectively. But when you're doing that, you're thinking, everybody else will agree with me, so therefore it's universal. This conveniently ignores how our tastes are inextricably linked to our cultural and our personal preferences, how high-taste landscapes can become status symbols, reinforcing social hierarchies. And so this is an exhibit in the Museum of Modern Art highlighting, featuring Chrissy Field, which was the project that I was showing through the past couple slides. All right, and aesthetics is the beautiful as it's emphasizing form, and it's also emphasizing that plan view. From the air, many contemporary park plans start to look the same, even though they're in very different places. But for me, one of the greatest challenges in applying the philosophies of the beautiful to landscape architecture is Kant's neatly divided categories, where aesthetics is not ethics, not science, art is not nature, not function, pleasure is not self-interested, not intellectual. But as we all know, or I think you probably assume that landscape architecture necessarily involves all of these things: ethics and science, nature and function, interest and intellect, all combined within a physical place. All right. So the second approach, aesthetics as the meaningful, can be linked to George Hegel's lectures on aesthetics. And so according to Hegel, the purpose of art is to capture the spirit of the times, to express, in his words, the profoundest intuitions and ideas of their hearts. The best art is one that expresses the valued ideas and ideals of a culture, what Hegel calls, quote, the sensuous representation of the absolute itself. Hegel considers Greek sculpture to be the highest form of art because sculpture expresses the ideals of what the Greek culture aspired to be. So applied to landscape architecture, this approach sees the designer less as a visual artist and more as a poet or a cultural communicator. The designer's aim is to express meaning about what it is to be alive in this time and place. And there are many ways in which design can communicate meaning in a landscape. One way is by preserving and highlighting the layers of history in a landscape. And many of you are probably familiar with this project, Landschaft Park in Duisburg, North Germany. It was also in that Museum of Modern Art exhibit, just so you know that. And is created on the site of a former coal and steel production plant. And the present-day park retains the structures of the industrial past and reappropriates them for contemporary use and perhaps adding additional layers of meaning into the site. Another way which designers can bring meaning to places is through symbolism. And so in this example on the Madrid waterfront, The designers took the idea of the parterre from European landscape history, but by making them kind of large and exuberant, they're implying that the parterres are freed from the formal palaces of the past and placed out into the public realm. But the primary way I think designers are taught to bring meaning into design is through what we call conceptual design. And so this is how I and Brad were taught design in our very first studio, and he probably remembers John Emerson saying, "What is your concept? What is your concept?" But we were taught to select a concept or an idea behind the design, and then that concept would drive all of our design decisions: the color, the choice, the materials, the composition. So, a well-known example of this would be California Scenario by Noguchi, where it's representing an abstracted form of California landscapes. Another designer that I would say does a lot of this conceptual design would be Lawrence Halprin. This is his Freeway Park in Seattle and his abstracted version of the canyons and the forests around Seattle. And the final example I wanted to share is the Schoeberg line in Rotterdam. According to the Museum of Modern Art exhibit catalog, it is, quote, "a compelling formal exercise in material and meaning." The towering machine-like light masts painted bright red were inspired by the industrial cranes of the Rotterdam port. Those are just some of the night images that were also from that exhibit. Right, so critics of the aesthetic of the meaningful point out that landscapes are much more than texts to be read or interpreted. And another issue with this might be that some things are lost in translation. I showed this project to my students a couple of weeks ago, and I asked them what they thought the masts represent or what it made them think of. And the first thing it made them think of were the Pixar light in the little logo, not the Rotterdam port. So, but also, for places to mean something to people, I think people need to not just read them, they need to be able to attach to them and engage with them. And although Schoeberg line was designed to be an active public stage and a place for public participation, its lack of human scale elements really make it hard to be that. So, the only human scaled element in the entire plaza is this little entrance to the underground parking lot. And when I visited the plaza back in 2010, the whole place was empty except for that entrance. And it was like people were drawn to it like a magnet. They were looking for something, anything of human scale to just kind of attach to or be near. So it's not surprising that despite its award-winning design, it wasn't long before people wanted to change the plaza. And currently these temporary modifications like artificial turf, trees, and other plants and planters have been added to the plaza to make it more inhabitable. And just this past year, they've been developing new designs for the plaza. Right, so, a challenge for aesthetic as the meaningful as an approach is that landscapes do not always communicate literal meanings. Often our experiences in them escape words. And I really like these quotes from Jane Gillette, where she points out that landscapes are not symbols or representations of something else. They are what she calls actuality, the actual material world. As she says, the garden is what it is. It doesn't mean something, it is something. So landscapes do not have to have explicit meaning to be enjoyable or pleasurable. And while these critiques do not preclude landscapes from conveying meaning, they question whether communication should be the primary goal of design. On the other hand, I would say that considering landscapes as meaningful as opposed to solely pleasurable allows designers to bring culture into the conversation in a way that the beautifuls focus on forms and compositions do not. So when we realize that as design we are writing our own culture, so to speak, the aesthetic debate becomes much more complex. Understanding the role of landscapes as cultural artifacts allows us to discuss political aspects of our work instead of pretending that aesthetic decisions can be isolated from ethical concerns. All So the third and final perspective on aesthetics considers aesthetics as an experience. And this was inspired by phenomenology and also the philosophy of John Dewey. And it focuses on not the environment as an object, but the interaction between people and their environment. So according to Dewey, aesthetic pleasure is found in the interaction between an organism and its surrounding environment. So thinking of landscapes as experiences, they become more than beautiful visuals or meaningful texts. Landscapes are where we live out our lives. So design starts by considering how a person senses and experiences a landscape, by moving through it in a body, rather than as a visual composition or intellectual exercise. One example of how this is taught in landscape architecture is Catherine Dee's book, Form and Fabric in Landscape Architecture. And you can see that compared with Norman Booth's focus on the plan view composition, Dee is really focusing on the elements in the landscape and how they create a human experience, how we move through it, how we rest, what we feel, and what we observe. So, but if everything's an experience, which you could claim that it is, what makes an experience aesthetic? What should art aim towards? According to Dewey, art should, quote, concentrate and enlarge an immediate experience. And applied to landscape architecture, I think this suggests that landscape architects should aim, to quote Catherine Howitt, opportunities for intensely vivid and immediate encounters with the natural world, and designs that deliberately engage us in a more complex immersion of the thisness in a place. So some landscape theorists in this perspective suggest that design should support and reflect what they call optimum patterns of living. So by creating the right fit between the person and his environment, the experience is enhanced. And others suggest instead that designs might need to shake us up, remove us from the humdrum of daily life, and reawaken experience. And as what Elizabeth Meyer calls a perceptual entanglement between a sensing body and the world, this approach involves both sense and thought, images and texts, both the beautiful and the meaningful. And so because of that, I chose the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery as an example, because it's not just aesthetic as an experience, it also contains elements of the beautiful and the meaningful. So, looking at the memorial, you cannot deny that the designers have a strong understanding of how to arrange forms in complex, coherent, interesting, and attractive compositions. But then also, the design is meaningful and I even say heavy, which, literally and figuratively with meaning. But in addition to those two aspects, I think it's how a person moves through the memorial and experiences it that's the key to its aesthetics. So when you enter it, you're confronted face to face with the names of lynching victims. And then as you move through the site, the ground plane lowers, which it makes it feel like the monuments are rising up above you until they're hanging overhead. And so to me, this experience is full of meaning, but it's also somewhat beyond meaning. It's, exceeds what words can really capture. So this attention to what a person experiences as they move through the site does more than communicate the meaning. It creates an experience that combines both thought and emotions that can be powerful and moving. But then there is a hesitation I have about this aesthetics as experience approach. And it's, if you're designing to create a specific emotional reaction in a person, or what Elizabeth Meyer calls an affective strike, at what point does design become manipulation? And I'm not aiming that critique at this memorial because I think there's a reason behind why they want people to feel the way that they do. But I'm thinking in terms of, should all designed landscapes create some kind of emotional impact on people? And I'm seeing a new trend in contemporary parks that they are being designed to heighten, enhance, and create new exciting experiences, including the Keinberg Park, which I showed in a couple earlier slides. It had the observation tower and then also the nature bobsled. And then this park, the Gathering Place in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So in many ways, I see this as a positive development, making parks more lively and interesting. But sometimes it feels a little overdone, blurring the line between amusement park and public park. And one, or at least I am left feeling a little overwhelmed and overstimulated. But I would argue that these parks do not really reflect the understanding of experience as Dewey puts it forth. In these parks, as in amusement parks, we think that the designer or the creator is the one who's making the experience, and the visitors, or what we call the users, are undergoing the experience. But for Dewey, experiences are more complex. So according to Dewey, experience always involves a doing as well as an undergoing. So people do not only passively experience a place, they actively create that experience while being in the place. So another way to think about it is, a subject's needs, purposes, and preferences are just as active as the designers in the creation of an experience. But then, if experience depends so much on the background and interest of the participant, where does that leave us as designers? Can one create a design that satisfies everyone's needs, purposes, and preferences? Should we even try? Or can design be open-ended enough to allow people to engage with a place on their own terms? And will an open-ended aesthetic really diminish the role and the value of the professional designer? And so these are some of the questions that I'm grappling with, and I think this idea of aesthetic as an experience leaves us as designers with more questions than answers. But a preliminary answer I have, it's my own take on it, to these questions is inspired again by Catherine Howitt's words. And she says, we need to design places in which we are invited to experience nature and others. And so this idea of design as an invitation intrigues me. Perhaps the aesthetic aim of design is not always about creating an experience of beauty, meaning, or pleasure. Perhaps it can also be an invitation for people to find their own beauty, meaning, and pleasure within the world. And I don't think this will take less skill as a designer, just maybe different kinds of skills. But what would that look like? First of all, it would be tied to the people and the place from which the experience emerges, so there wouldn't be like one ideal look or style. But the project that always comes to mind when I think of this is this Prinzessinnengarten in Berlin, Germany. And it's a community garden with food production. They have clothing exchanges, educational events. They also have, on the left, a viewing tower, which also has a swing and some other things. So these experiences that do remove us from the humdrum of daily life and maybe heighten our experience. And then experiences that also might fit more into our daily life, like the food court / beer garden on the right. It also has a process that allows people to participate in the making of the place, so people can propose projects and add to the aesthetic experience in the garden. Okay, so to summarize, the beautiful and the meaningful are often pitted against each other in landscape architecture discourse. It's form versus content, image versus text, feeling versus thought. And aesthetic as an experience, it has the potential to be this umbrella term that kind of covers them both and overcomes those divisions. But again, as designers, that approach leaves us more questions than answers when we wonder about, can we really control the experience of another person? Do we want to control the experience of another person? And so as I reflected on what I learned in this review and what it might mean for how we define aesthetics, I realized that these three have one thing in common. Whether you're looking at the experience of beauty, if you're looking at cultural meanings or personal experiences, to me, they all describe an aspect of landscape architecture that can't be reduced to instrumental, universal, or generalizable solutions. So I propose that maybe the concept of aesthetics in landscape architecture in its most basic form is a placeholder for what lies outside of these generalizable solutions and scientific methods. And so, what is that? It's this particular immediate, entangled, unpredictable experience of a landscape, something that can't ever really be completely captured in words or moved to another location. It is what I think Jane Gillette calls actuality, and what Catherine D. calls the encounter of things as they are and as we are bound to them in momentary conditions, the recognition of the real. Perhaps then design should not necessarily aim towards a perfect arrangement of forms or a symbolic collective meaning, but instead towards an invitation for a deeper engagement with a particular place and time. Perhaps this adds curiosity and exploration to our list of aesthetic aims alongside pleasure and meaning. And perhaps also design can invite people to share their own experiences of place with each other. By adding to our shared environment, people are sharing a piece of themselves, sharing what matters to them with others. And I think in many of the places that bring me joy, that's what's happening there. People are engaged deeply, often playfully, with the place and with their world. And in them, I catch a glimpse into their experience, like what joys, pleasures, comforts they want to create and share, what they want the world to be and have, and perhaps ultimately what they want the world to be. So in conclusion, accepting aesthetics as this particular immediate, non-generalizable experience, makes it challenging to teach or evaluate. There are no simple rules to follow. There's no obvious outcomes. But I think if we start to teach aesthetics as skills, like the skills of noticing, interpreting, appreciating, questioning, then designers can start to reflect the richness of materials, senses, and meanings that exist in the world around us. And as designers, we'll be able to better embrace and celebrate what makes places complex, meaningful, and unique. So, thank you.